After the light attack experiment, as predicted, the Air Force bought nothing. So a lot of folks had leaned forward. I know we spent upwards of $30 million developing that software specific to Scorpion Jet. And I know there were some communications made to the government about, hey, you keep asking us to do this on our own dime. At the end of the day, it's a company that has to make money. I understand if you don't buy our product, but you didn't buy any product and you asked industry to spend a hell of a lot of money, which they did. And I know Textron spent quite a bit of money. They built 2 of those jets. I know they're still out there. I presume they're still flying in one form or another.
Buck, welcome to 10%. It is truly great to see you.
Steve, I am more than pleased to see you as well. I consider us old friends, even though we haven't been in the same room. But I'm really honored to be on the podcast. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I was going to open. So we always do with guests. We always have a little chat before we start, and then I hit record. And I didn't say this to you when we were doing our pre-record chat, but I think you are not the hardest person to get on, but the second hardest person to get to speak to. So I don't know how many years ago it was that I originally approached you and said, would you let me interview you? Because I was writing about Iraqi freedom, I think, or Enduring Freedom, one of those two. And at the time you were flying AC-130s, you were doing a lot of work with special operations guys, and you were, maybe I will, maybe I won't. And we never made it happen. And I think that might have been, 2003 was when that stuff was all kicking off.
Oh, yeah.
So I think it might have been about 20 years ago. It may have been 2005 or so. So it's taken a long time to get to the point where we can talk. So thank you.
You're making me feel old, man. 20 years. Wow.
You and I both. So I should also point out that I think you have the best background of any guest that I've had on the channel. I think there's a display of the accomplishments that you've had in your career and the platforms that you've flown. For the benefit of anybody listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any other podcasting platform, Buck is surrounded by paraphernalia from AC-130 and T-38 and various other platforms that he's flown. So, and speaking of which, if you are listening at home to this and you're not watching the YouTube version, probably is going to be worth you getting onto the YouTube version, because Buck's going to display some pictures and we're going to see some of the things that he's going to be talking about. And the focus of today's episode is light attack. So Buck was flying the light attack platforms that Hanky and Starbaby talked about in the last episode, namely 86 and A29 came along later. He was flying those in the 2000s, and he's going to talk about that. And he later was part of the Scorpion program, and he even was involved in the Skyraider II. And we're going to do a separate episode on Skyraider II where Buck's going to come back and talk to us about that. Buck will also, I hope, come back and talk to us about flying the gun peg, the AC-130. I know he's got some cracking stories about that. And he also flew the Osprey as well, the CV-22 or
CV-22, yeah.
Okay, so CV-22, and I'm really hoping we can talk about that too. So Buck will, I hope, become a familiar face and voice on the channel in the coming months. I'm looking forward to doing that. But for the purposes of today, we're focusing on light attack. So Buck, do you want to tell us a little bit firstly about your Air Force career and what it was that you did and where you ended up, and then maybe we can understand how it is you ended up flying 86 and other light attack platforms?
Yeah, happily. It's a long and winding road to get there. And while I'm probably, I'm pleased you might want to have me back. I'm not as prolific as Starbaby, but I did promise you a story at some point of how my career was made by a Boston cream donut. So we'll get to that in non-Latin. I know Starbaby will be disappointed, but so yeah, I was an Air Force pilot for 26 years. Retired as a colonel back in 2016. And I'll kind of do the shorter form. So hopefully when we talk gunships, I'll talk more about some of the things I did there. But I talked about my career kind of in 4 pillars, if you will. Kind of an ops pillar is the first one. A lot of time, about 4,000 hours in the gunship. lots of combat deployments and stuff like that. But on the ops side, I was also very fortunate to get selected to go to the Air Force Weapons School. And that really kind of changed me, not only as an aviator and an instructor, but kind of as a human being. And somehow, being a knuckle dragger, they asked me to stay. So I stayed for 3.5 years as an instructor there. Thought I had achieved terminal velocity and escaped because I was tired when I left. But they brought me back later on in my career to be an OPSO and then a squadron commander within the weapons school. So all told, I spent 6.5 years of my Air Force career in the weapons school proper. So that's kind of the ops pillar. A little bit later on, I went on. It was a vice wing commander. It was a task force commander in Africa. The second pillar would be education, and I think it matters just a little bit because I'm probably one of the more overeducated pilots in the Air Force, probably because I'm a slow learner. But when I had finished pilot training, doing all my initial spin up, I had a great mentor. I actually had some very great mentors throughout my entire career. And one of them pulled me aside and said, "Hey, you're a lieutenant. You will never be less busy in your life. Go get your master's degree." So I did. And back in the day, my goal was to try and go to test pilot school. So I said, "Hey, I'm going to go get a technical master's," which I did in aerospace science with a center on aircraft design. I always had that somewhere stuck in my brain. Later on, the Air Force would send me back to Air Command and Staff College, get another master's degree there. And when I finished that, my mentors again stepped in and said, "Hey, you're going to apply to this program called the Advanced Studies Group." And each one of the services has kind of a second year program. The Air Force School is called the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. The Marines have one called SAW, and the Army has SAMS. The Navy's slightly different. So I applied to the Air Force program and the Marine program, and somehow ended up at Quantico for a year. I went from a class of 600 majors at Air Command and Staff College down to a school of just 24 students, and they poured tons of resources on us. It was educationally the best year of my life. I read 271 books in 1 year. And I went there thinking, "Oh, it's the Marines. How tough could it be?" And it was the cream of the crop of the Marines. These guys, they would assign us to read Clausewitz on war, and we're going to have a 2-hour seminar. So I read the 400 pages. I'm going to go in there and clean these guys' clocks. Well, the Marines, just part of their normal development, had read the 400 pages before and the 400 pages after. And I thought, wow, I am going to have to swim a lot harder. So I did that program, another master's degree. I went back for War College, and I'll weave that into the story because it kind of plays a little bit on light attack. And then as a colonel, I got picked up to do the SOCOM fellowship. I went to Harvard and did all that gig. So that's, another pillar, fairly well established. The third pillar is the staff. And I know for a lot of folks, staff is the S word. I'll probably touch on that because I think it's important that we send the right people to the staff. What I would always tell my bright and shiny pennies is, I know you don't want to go to the staff and not fly for a while, but the staffs are critically manned. And if I don't send a super sharp racehorse, then somebody else is going to be sitting in that seat making decisions about resourcing, equipment, whatever capabilities are going to be on the airplane. You're going to have to live with the consequences. So it's a necessary evil at time. But I did 3 key staff tours that really helped shape me and my understanding of what was going on, and actually brought me a lot closer to light attack. My first assignment after SAW was working in a little strategy cell called A8XC. I was supposed to go to Checkmate. Star Baby talked about the skunks. Checkmate is kind of another little group. One looks shorter term, one looks longer term. And then while I was in 8XC, I got pulled up to be the exec for the Deputy Chief Staff of the Air Force. So I saw how the sausage was made at a service level, which was, kind of crazy. As a colonel, I went back, and my joint assignment was in OSD Cape. They're the arm of OSD that grades the homework of all the services as they submit their requirements and their palms and make their resourcing decisions. And they're kind of seen as the bad guys because they'll tell the services, "No, you're not meeting the secretary's intent or the president's intent." And then my last assignment initially was as the AFSOC A58 and then as the A51. So I got to see how The sausage was made at a MAGCOM level, at a service level, and then overall at a DoD level. So that kind of rounded out that pillar of the staff. And then the fourth pillar, when I retired, I went into industry, worked strategy, and helped as a SME on some of these platforms like Scorpion, and then, as you alluded to, on what is now the Skyraider II. So a pretty diverse background that prepared me, to be in this environment.
Going to make for some fantastic listening. I'm really looking forward to it. I am, genuinely. Tell us the story then. You gave me a précis when, like you said at the beginning, we've known each other. Feels like we've known each other for a really long time. This is the first time we've ever actually spoken face to face. We've had some communications over the years, and you did share a story with me, the précis, if you will, for how you ended up getting into the light attack side of things. Can you share that story with the audience and describe the pathway that you took?
Yeah, and I think it's important to have a little bit of a preamble even to that, in that I think it was in episode 2. I think I've listened up through 3. Starbaby talked about having seen the Super Tucano on the ramp around the 2008 timeline, and kind of set the seed in his brain. On the special operations side of the fence, we'd always been talking about light attack. And I think it was just in the DNA of the command. SOCOM, Air Force Special Operations Command, stood up after Operation Eagle Claw. That was an outflow of the failed Iran hostage rescue. But before that, they existed in the form of 23rd Air Force, going all the way back to World War II, a group called the Chindits. And basically, it was a group of people that did things with, I don't want to say lesser, but more utility type aircraft. And, they flew C-47s and all sorts of things, doing different types of missions. And I remember being in the AFSOC commander's staff room or conference room one time, and they were talking about light attack and putting guns on stuff. Oh, it was on the CV-22. We were going to put either a chin-mounted chain gun, or in the hell hole, there's a bottom piece on the CV-22. They were talking about putting a gun there, and there was some initial pushback. And he's like, "Why wouldn't we? Have you guys been out to our air park? And every airplane AFSOC's ever had has either a gun, a rocket, or a bomb on it." And he was mostly right, with the exception of the MC-130s at that point. And even the MC-130s had dropped the MOAB. But if you go through the air park to this day, and if you ever come, I'll walk you out there, the 01 Bird Dog, used as one of the first FAC airplanes, 2.75-inch rockets. My junior ROTC commander won the Air Force cross flying that airplane. And there's a picture of him holding an M16 out the window, wailing away on the guys on the ground. They have OV-10s out there. They have the OA-37, just everything. So it was in our DNA. And I think it really started to gain a little bit of momentum again in the early 2000s, as OEF and OIF are kind of, starting to spiral up. At that point, AFSOC had stood up the 6th SOS, Special Operations Squadron, which was a squadron focused on foreign internal defense. And that's something we probably haven't talked to yet in this realm, but the whole background of FID, and I don't want to slight the guys. I was not what I would call a FID guy, but it's helping partner nations build the capability on their own. And that is, the United States can't be everywhere. We're trying to help these people put down these brush fires all around the world. And if you go back and read our doctrine, there's something called BPC, Building Partner Capacity. So as a result, the 6th had UH-1s. They had Mi-8 helicopters. I believe it was a Bassler version of the DC-3, a DC-3 that had the turboprop modification. They had an AN-2 Colt. That's the old Soviet biplane. They had a AN-24, which is a medium to light turboprop lift Soviet-style airplane. And they were taking the platforms that a lot of our friends were flying, and we had pilots that got current in it. They had language training. They were regionally specialists. And you would go fly with that host nation and teach them how to do some of the higher end missions that we had done in SOCOM. Things like fast rope, or flying on NVGs, low level at night on NVGs. And in the extreme model of employing that, you could buy a couple of these airframes, deploy to country X, teach them how to fly, leave the airplanes, get on a commercial plane and fly home and let them put down whatever the unrest was. So within that realm, as they were established, the chatter about light attack had started to percolate. And I was in the weapons school at that time. A lot of people were talking about, I thought, okay, I couldn't write my weapons school paper about it. I did mine on 30 millimeter. But when I got picked up to go to Air Command and Staff College, I'm like, perfect. This is going to be my opportunity. I'm going to talk about I'm going to write about light attack. And when I got there, they have a list of suggested paper topics they want people to look at. They go out and pulse the MAGCOMs. And I said, initially, this is what I wanted to write about. Well, one of the more popular things at that point was incorporating small diameter bomb onto the gunships. And I had done some preliminary work at the weapons school. So I ended up doing a pivot. I wrote my paper on that. So I thought, okay, I know somebody else will get to it. Well, luckily, the year after me, another guy did. His name was Arthur Dwight Davis. It was a nav in the gunship. We called him affectionately Double D. And he wrote a paper called Back to Basics. It turned out to be the best paper at Air Command and Staff College that year. And it really sent some shockwaves, I think, through the system and through the community, because he put down some very cogent thoughts on how you could bring light attack back to the Air Force, specifically within the SOCOM realm, but the things that it would give you for a very small a bit of investment. And so I thought, okay, great. This is marching right along. I think he had an assignment at the Pentagon. We talked a little bit about his paper and stuff. And I'm up in the boss's office as his exec when one day he says, "Hey, I got a proposal for you. Do you want to sit here and keep pushing paper at the desk, or do you want to go fly for a bit?" And he didn't even finish asking the question when I was looking for my helmet bag, and I'm like, "Okay, tell me where." And luckily, the Textron guys had the first iteration of the AT6, and they were looking for people to go out and fly it and do an evaluation. So I'll go ahead and do a little bit of a share here. I went out and flew the first iteration of the AT6. And a couple things stood out to me. I really enjoyed the platform. Even a knuckle dragon pilot like me could fly it with reasonable ease. What I noticed first and foremost was this particular iteration, being the very first offering, was going to be more of a mud fighter. It didn't have a sensor provision. They were talking about it, but it was going to be a mud fighter. And there were pluses in that realm, and there were minuses. And I wrote it all up. Some of the pluses, the mission management system they had in it was fairly rudimentary. So even a guy like me had no problem doing it. For doing guns, it was the standard CCIP. So you put the thing on the thing and pull the trigger, no problem. Dropping bombs was the same thing. But what really impressed me was, of all things, the rockets. So they weren't using APKWS at the time. They were using unguided. And what they had done was they had put an ellipse. I was told it came out of the A10. I never was able to confirm that. But it put an ellipse on the ground out in front of in the HUD, and the size of the ellipse would expand or contract based on your pitch angle and if you were on parameter. And very quickly, it became apparent to me that, especially in a low altitude delivery, you could bunt the nose, probably something you don't want to do on a really fast moving airplane, but endgame, you could bunt the nose and the ellipse would get down really small and you could pitch all your rockets into a very tight space. So if you're doing things like suppressing an enemy, it was going to be very, very effective. Landing it wasn't a big deal. Power and performance. I believe I had been told that the T6s the Navy and the Air Force use in the pilot training realm, they have detuned the turbine down to 1,100 shaft horsepower, whereas in the first iteration, they had uprated it, I believe, to 1,400. And then later on for the test that Starbaby flew, I believe it was up to 1,600 shaft horsepower. But doing clean maneuvering, To me, man, it was a joy to fly. You could do a positive energy loop. It felt like it would be tough to get yourself in a corner with the airplane. But again, it's a trainer. It's meant to do that. Um, here's a picture, obviously, me sitting up front there, mugging for the camera. One of the other things that really stood out to me was how easy it was to maintain. And the operating cost was factored into the paper, but in those days, you were looking at about $500 or less per flight hour. And they had maintained it for an entire month with just one crew chief. And really, all he was doing was refueling it, checking the oil, doing the basic TCTO compliance items, making sure, any regularly scheduled maintenance was complied with. But the thing just flew like a champ. Never lost a sortie. And to me, that was like, this is what a foreign partner is really going to need, something that's reliable, that can get out there and do the mission. Drawbacks, and I think this picture helps illustrate it. I've got another one I'll show here in a minute. The first drawback was the roll rate to me, and I know others didn't feel the same way. Coming from the 38, 720 degrees per second, being a straight wing trainer, it rolled just fine, but I knew because of the position of the wing, you were going to spend a lot of time rolling the airplane. If you're doing a belly check, a safe escape, or even seeing targets on the ground, because if you see in this picture here, and let me go to this next picture, it probably demonstrates a little bit better. This is actually a Navy variant, but this is looking out from the pilot's perspective. You can see the wing and it's blocking the ground underneath you. So if you don't have a sensor, you're going to have to be up on your side if somebody's, if you're doing a tick or getting a talk on to a target. And to me, I was like, okay, this is something that, this can be overcome with TTPs, but I wrote it up in my eval as part of what I thought was a bit of a limitation. Put that eval into the system. I don't think anybody took it seriously. There were a number of us that went out and flew it, and they hadn't even, postulated to do a light attack experiment at that point. But to me, it was like, okay, this is a great platform, and it's going to offer a lot of capability down the line. The idea percolates in my brain, and I'm still thinking the whole time I'm back in the building, what can I do to help further this cause? And then, of course, out of cycle, I get picked up to go back to the weapons school to be an ops officer and then a squadron commander. And honestly, your whole brain shifts. People think it's tough to go through weapons school as a student. It's really tough to be an instructor there. It's a grind. You have to stay ahead of the students. So my whole mentality shifted. Plus, my wife was pregnant at the time, so light attack right off the table. And I'm not thinking about it too much. A couple of years later, and it's kind of funny how this whole thing plays out for me, is I had been a squadron commander for about 10 months and a little over 10 months. And the boss, the 57th Wing Commander, called me and said, hey, Craig, we're going to go ahead and move you out of command early. And I got to tell you, I was devastated. I'm like, I've been fired. And I couldn't figure out why. And I'm like, hey, sir, what did I do wrong? He said, you didn't do anything wrong. No big deal. You're good. And but in the back of my mind, it was just this black cloud hanging over me. So he said, hey, I've talked to General Hawley. He was the ACC commander at the time. And he said, you have to get at least a year. So you're going to get a year and a day. So we did that. And I came home to my wife. I said, I don't know what happened. I don't know what I did. And I don't even know what's next. What are they going to do with me? And I assumed, hey, they'll just send me over the group to be a deputy over there, hang out and figure out what's going on. And 2 days later, I get a call and they said from the A1 folks said, hey, you're going to go to school early in your first look. And I'm like, they're taking me out of command to go to school. They're just trying to pawn me off on somebody at this point is what's going through my brain. So they said, hey, you're going to go to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. And there's that advanced school that I had gone to with the Marines. The Army had their school there. And they said, hey, there's a fellowship. You'll do the fellowship. And then likely you'll stay. About 50% of the people stay and they're instructors at SAMS after that. And I came home and talked to the wife. And I'm like, no, not going to do it. So I declined school. And, that's a Red Star cluster shot in the air. Your career is over when you do that. So a couple hours later, after I decline, I get a call from the boss again. He's, "What have you done?" And I'm like, "Well, you fired me. You're not fired." And he said, "What's going on? Why don't you want to go?" And I said, "Well, look, my wife's having some medical issues. When we were in DC, it's where it started. She had great quality of care there. We have great quality of care here. And I don't want to go to Leavenworth, Kansas. Nothing against Leavenworth or the Army, but I don't want to start over with her care." He immediately jumped on me. He's like, "Hey, why didn't you tell me this?" I'm like, "Well, I didn't think you're going to fire me. So I thought I'd tell you next year when the assignment was over." So he goes, "All right, where will you go?" And I'm like, "Wait, am I playing chicken with the system and somehow winning? Because once you say no, that's supposed to be it." And I said, "Look, sir," I said, "I'll go anywhere in the Beltway. If I can get back up to DC, my wife's family's there, and the quality of care is there, so I know I can fall back on that." I said, "No, there's tons of fellowships. There's all the schools. I'm not trying to be picky. If you can just get me there." He goes, "All right, give me 24 hours." So he called me the next morning, goes, "Will you go back to Quantico?" And I'm like, "In a heartbeat. That's a known entity to me." So I get orders to go to Quantico, to go to Marine War College. But I'm still kind of sailing along with this black cloud hanging over me, thinking my career is over with. We move up there, and I've been there like a week or two, and a buddy of mine calls me. I won't say his name. He's retired now, but he really did me a solid. And he said, "Hey, Buck, I hear you're kind of moping around a little bit and struggling." I'm like, "Well, man, I got fired. This is BS." And he goes, "Dude, you didn't get fired." And I'm like, why is he reaching out to me anyways? He's up in the Pentagon. He works in their colonels group. And he goes, "Hey, man, think about it logically." He was a patch too. And he goes, "Think about it logically, man. Why would they move you?" And I said, "Well, they move you when you get fired." And he goes, "Okay, you didn't get fired. Why else would they move you?" And I said, "Well, the only other thing, they're making room for some fast mover." He goes, "Nope. What else?" And I said, "Well, they move people and they get promoted." And he goes, "Yeah." And I said, "But no, I'm too below the zone." And he goes, "Yeah." So unbeknownst to me, I'm moping around this whole time. I had been picked up a couple of years below the zone to colonel. And now the whole trajectory of my career changes, and I'm such a bonehead. I'm wrapped up in this. I'm not even thinking about the possibility that this could happen. So it really changed everything from there. And now I'm at senior service school. I've kind of got this clean mental bill of health. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to write about light attack. And I really poured myself into it. That was my paper that year. It was a classified paper, mainly because I was able to get access to a lot of the flying hour costs that were associated with all the different platforms were out there. And at that time, the Air Force was really starting to feel the pinch of the pilot shortage, specifically the fighter pilot shortage. So, using a numbers-based approach, I wrote this paper, and we're getting close to graduation. I submit the paper, get the grade, everything's good. I'm like, okay, and I get a call, and I was supposed to. The colonel's group had the list had come out, and they said, "Hey, you're going to go to a classified job out west." I'm like, "Awesome, looking forward to it." And then I get a call about a week before graduation, and they said, "Hey, yeah, put on your Class A's and go to the Pentagon and go to this room and ask for Miss Simmons." And I'm like, "What in the heck is happening to me now?" So real quick, I'm like, "Who's Miss Simmons?" I Google her and I find out she works in OSD Cape. She is in charge of TAC Air for all of DoD. And I think she's retired now or moved on. Just an outstanding human being, by the way. I'll say that up front. So I go up to the Pentagon. I ask, Miss Simmons. They're like, "Yeah, come on in. She's waiting for you." And I go in, and she's like, "Hey, Buck, I read your paper. I loved it, and I'd like you to come work in OSD Cape." I'm like, "Oh, okay, great. Let's do it." So they change my assignment. I show up, get all in process, and the first week she says, "Okay, Buck, I want you to take your paper, and I want you to condense it down to just a couple pages. I'd like it to be a white paper, but I want you to build out what I get if I give up one squadron of F-35s." And I immediately get, "Oh man, this is a third rail this is going to get some heat. And I'm like, okay. And she goes, you have free reign. I want to know how many airplanes I get, how many flight hours, and you tell me how you would build this apparatus within DoD. And I had already had kind of a thumbnail outline of how I would do it. And the numbers were very compelling. Basically, the Air Force would have gotten 120 light attack airplanes. The math at that time was based on the AT-6 and the Super Tucano. Those were the two platforms that made the most sense. But shockingly, you got about 100,000 flying hours.
Wow.
And yeah, which was just such a compelling argument in my mind, because the people that were getting out of the Air Force, it was a lot of mid-tier people, their initial pilot training commitment was up. So they were senior captains, young majors that were all instructor pilots, and that experience was just walking out the door, and you cannot recreate that overnight.
Just on that, then, can you just tell us quickly what sort of time, what sort of year are we talking about? So this is Iraqi freedom, enduring freedom are already happening. The Air Force is already fighting this non-traditional warfare. There's lots of close air support, troops in contact, forward air control type stuff going on. So is that the relevance for Miss Simmons wanting to know then what she could get instead of a squadron of F-35s?
It is. This is 2010 timeframe. Secretary Gates was in the seat at that point. He had been pretty direct with the Air Force that they were going to stand up more UAS orbits, more RPA orbits, and they were taking pilots out of cockpits all over the place to fill these orbits. And it was the collision of that, the collision of a lot of people were tired because we've been fighting for 9 years at that point, and a lot of folks were getting out of the Air Force. So it had created a gap. I think the peak of the gap was around 2,800 fighter pilots short. Wow. And yeah, it was pretty big. I think it's still fairly large at this point today. I think it's around 1,800. My math may be a little bit off, but there was extreme pressure. And they were looking for a way to get more capability out there that was manned. And then I latched onto that as a way to help save the system a little bit, if you will, because now with all these flying hours, you could help season a lot of pilots very quickly and very cheaply. So when I built out what I thought it would look like, I put a couple of squadrons in the same locations where they had F-16s and A-10s. I put 2 squadrons in Air Force Special Operations Command so they could leverage off the gunships and then help with that foreign internal defense mission. But I really saw that you were going to get a lot of payback if you could put it at the same base as some of the more conventional fighter units. You would help younger pilots build muscle memory faster. Just being on the same base, they were going to be able to interact. You still had to have a core cadre of light attack people. I didn't want it to just be a puppy mill, if you will, because you had to dedicate yourself to the mission. But you could very quickly rotate folks through, and they could get 1,000 hours, and it wasn't going to cost the Air Force very much. They could get 1,000 hours in 3 years, and now they've got the airmanship and the skills. They know what it's like to do CAS and some of the other things. Their transition to the Viper or the Hog was going to be a lot easier. So I wrote that paper up. I spent a couple of weeks on it, had it all prim and proper. And standard Air Force white paper, you put your name down at the bottom. Ms. Simmons takes the paper, and I'm told later it goes up to SecDef, and it gets a little bit of attention. And I get a call at my desk, and I won't say who it was, but it was a very senior Air Force general officer, and it was like, "Hey, Buck, you got to come home at some point, son." I'm like, "Are you kidding me?" I couldn't believe it because, I'm doing what the law says. I'm in a joint billet where I'm supposed to do what the joint force, in this case, the Secretary of Defense, is asking me to do. But it was such a third rail. They saw the impact, and the fact that they were going to lose a squadron of 5th Gen was just something they couldn't deal with. So I went back to Miss Simmons and I said, "Hey, here's what's going on." And to her credit, she immediately took the white paper, took my name off, put her name on. And she said, "I don't think that's going to be enough, and I want to protect you and your career." So they decided to move me to another office within OSD Cape. I moved over to irregular warfare, and it was such a hot button issue. My backfill, who they just announced his retirement this week, Francis Ekman, He was at National War College. They pulled him out of National War College to backfill me in the seat.
Wow.
And he showed up and he's like, Buck, what have you done to me? You know? And I'm like, I didn't do it. I'm sorry, Francis. But that's how important it was. I had never heard of anybody being pulled out of school to backfill a staff job. So yeah, it was very interesting times to see what was going on with that. Eventually, they started talking more about a light attack experiment, combat dragon, and all of that. And I get over to irregular warfare, and I think at that point, Star Baby, I don't want to step on his toes. He talks about some folks that were running that initially acquired the OV10s. He doesn't want to say their name. I'm pretty sure he's talking about Convoy and Hey Joe. Convoy being an F-18 driver who had worked on the F-18 or had worked on Super Tucano, and Hey Joe was a retired F-14 Rio who, in a civilian capacity, was helping that program along. And the way it was explained to me, they all came to the office as soon as I got into the irregular warfare office, and they knew that I had written about light attack. They show up and they're like, "Hey, we need some money. You got to help us." They had been flying the Super Tucano down at Pax River on some sort of funding experiment project, and they had run out of money. And these guys were so dedicated, they had moved out of their hotels, and for a couple of weeks, they were sleeping in their hangar looking for alternate ways to get money and keep the thing alive. And at that point, it had timed out. They had to give the airplane back. So they shifted their attention over to the OV10. And by happenstance, we found out that they had a new administrator at NASA that was kind of looking at their aircraft fleet and said, "Why do I have these OV10s? What can we do with them?" And here's some light attack guys that will happily take them over. So I think I'll share again for just a minute.
Can I don't want to interrupt your flow. Before you
Go
do
ahead.
that, can I just ask a couple of questions about
Of course,
the time
yeah.
period that's gone on? Because it's fascinating listening to you talk to you. I genuinely don't want to interrupt you because I just want to carry on listening. But there's just some questions in my mind, and I don't really want to get into AC-130 because I want that to be part of our dedicated episode on you flying the gunship. But what's very clear is that you're talking very specifically around Special Operations Command and with that sort of lens and that sort of optic on things. And Starbaby talked in a previous episode, I think it was part 2 of the series, where he talked about really this being a conventional forces type analysis for him. So he wasn't really looking at it from a special operations point of view because they were provisioned with their own capabilities. And I think you commented on YouTube to say that's exactly right. You know, when you were flying AC-130, you saw that. So I don't really want to get into that at the moment, but it would be good to discuss that in the dedicated episode. But what I do want to know is a little bit about how being an AC-130 guy and working special operations impacts your perspective on light attack. So when you were flying 86 initially, you just shared the screen and showed the positives and the negatives. And I wonder, is, close air support and an AC-130 for special operations the same thing as a foreign nation providing close air support to regular troops in a in a conventional war scenario, and what provisions do you have to make then when you're doing these assessments and when you're looking at these platforms to make sure you're sort of stepping beyond just your special operations experience?
Yeah, it's different when you're doing soft operations. I think one of the best ways to describe it is it's a much smaller community than you might think. I think soft today is around 67,000 people in the entire command. But when it comes to the operators and the aviators, the numbers are much smaller. When I flew the H model gunship, there were only 8 AC-130Hs in the Air Force.
Wow.
And yeah, we're low density, high demand. So as a result, we end up habitually training with a lot of the same ground folks, all the SEALs, the ODA, Green Berets, on a regular basis. They would come to Hurlburt for training. We would go do bilats, multilats, and it was to the point, especially when we were in combat, that you would recognize the guy's voice on the radio, and you could recognize the octave in their voice that would tell you just how serious the situation was.
Really?
They were on the ground. I think, shooting danger close in particular. That's been discussed in some other areas when you're shooting in very close proximity. When you hear that person saying, "Man, you got to do it, or we're going to die," that really brings your focus in. And when you push the button and the thing is on the thing and the thing's going to hit the bad guy, I can remember a couple times shooting Danger Close. It was just saying a prayer, don't let me screw this up. The worst possible thing in the world would be to frat somebody on the ground. So that level of training that we had, I think, and it's not putting our partners down, they just didn't have the number of reps that we did. We really trained to a high standard. I don't know what it would, Star Baby could certainly answer this question, but in the Strike Eagle, how many of his missions in the training environment he would employ actual munitions? In the AC-130, 90% of my training missions, I employed actual munitions. And being a small, low density, high demand unit, we had the resourcing. We would go out and shoot almost every single day. And that really helped that fine motor skill. It helped exercise the crew dynamic because it truly is managing an orchestra on an AC-130 gunship. All the parts have to come together for you to be most effective. Whereas in the light attack for a partner nation, it's, I don't want to say it's simple, but it's probably more aligned to just a strafe run, putting a bomb down, even if it's a laser guided bomb. It's not a full up dynamic unit. There were engagements in Afghanistan, and we'll talk about it when we get to talking about Skyraider, but we would manage a cast stack, and being a FAC-A qualified dude out there in the battle space, I could have 7 or 8 airplanes in the stack with me, all employing munitions or deconflicting things on the ground. A partner nation is certainly not going to do that with a light attack airplane.
Wow. So do you, it's interesting, Starboy, we talked about the Afghan initial cadre for the Afghan National Army Air Force. I can't remember exactly what it was called, but that's the National Air Force of the Afghan nation made it even worse. And he was talking about how those guys were all above average by Air Force standards. Now, that's not to say that they're capable, because that's, as you've already explained, that's a factor of a number of different things: currency and experience, training, quality, and all that kind of stuff. But he said they were capable guys. But when you were looking at it from a foreign point of view, a foreign sort of investment point of view, do you then have to kind of dumb down your expectations? You're sort of dialing things back. And how do you do that? How do you, in a quantifiable way? How do you not just say, well, a finger in the air, it should be like this?
I think we did a lot of finger in the air. It's going to be like this. And I, dumbing it down, I certainly would never want to denigrate any of our foreign partners, because all of the folks I ever worked with, whether they were, had the same level of capability that we had or not, almost to a person, every single foreign soft person I worked with, they were dedicated to the mission and they were doing the best that they could. As I mentioned, they just didn't have the reps that I did, being able to go out 4 or 5 days each week and shoot live rounds. So I think a lot of it was experience based. It was number of reps. But I think as we looked at developing it for the foreign nations, we did try to simplify it. Just basic rudimentary stuff. Is it going to be a gun run? Is it going to be dropping a bomb? Is it going to be shooting a rocket? It's not going to be a full up dynamic casting engagement where I'm deconflicting headings. I had, an engagement in Afghanistan where I was deconflicting 4 hogs at the same time I'm shooting at the target. And I think we were putting steel on target every 15 seconds doing that. I would certainly not ask a partner nation to do that.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's an appetite whetter or a whetter of appetite for the AC-130 episode. Okay, cool. So sorry, I interrupted you. You were going to get to OV-10.
So this was the OV-10, one of the 2 NASA birds. They've already painted it and done some basic things. I wanted to point out a couple of things that were interesting. If you look up on the nose, NASA does a lot of different things with their airplanes. And one of the things they had done was this box that was mounted up on the nose. And the way it was explained to me, this was like the first generation of doing a GPS-enabled crop dusting capability. So you could program lanes into the system, and there were a series of lights that would show you your left of your lane, your right of your lane. Here's the green light. You're right down the middle of your lane. Similarly, on the back of the airplane, I don't know if people know, but the OV-10 also had a small cargo compartment. So you could actually, people have airdropped out of the back of it. On this particular one, they had put a water tank in the back, and it had a copper tube system all around the back of the airplane so that they could spray water. And what they were doing was they were using it for ice testing. They would get up to altitude at the freezing level, fly another airplane behind it, spray the water, and test some of the anti-ice capabilities of other aircraft. So it was kind of a hodgepodge of capability, and these guys needed a little bit of money to modify the airplanes, put a different mission management system in it. So I sent you that and sent you these pictures just to say, hey, I saw them in the very beginning before the guys had done all their hard work to modify them and get them ready to go down range. And it was just interesting that here they are, former NASA airplanes that nobody really seemed to know what to do with. So they ended up going downrange with Combat Dragon.
So did NASA, you said that at this point then you're working in the different office in the Pentagon. Did you say it was the irregular warfare?
It was still within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, OSD Cape, but the new office was the Irregular Warfare Division. So that's why the folks had come to me. They were going to do this kind of under the soft banner. I think that's how they had initially approached it. I was working everything from airplanes like this, resourcing the SEALs to, of all things, the Virginia payload module on the Virginia class submarine. People don't know that as part of the modification of that, SOCOM actually pitched in some money as they were adding tubes for shooting TLAMs. They also allocated a couple tubes to deliver SEALs out of the Virginia class. So that was part of that program. So somehow here's this knucklehead gunship guy working on resourcing for a submarine, which was very interesting back in those days.
Fascinating.
It was a crazy office.
So Starbaby talked to a little bit. I'm just trying to understand. It's a bit boring, I know, and I won't labor the point, but I'm trying to understand organizationally how it all works. So Starbaby, this predates Starbaby's time at Nellis. So he goes to Nellis and works with the irregular warfare wing there as part of the, I don't know if it's the 57th Fighter Wing or I don't know which organizational unit it is, but so you're working irregular warfare in the Pentagon. There's regular warfare units in other parts of the Air Force around on other bases in other parts of the US. Are you all talking to each other then? Are you in your role in the Pentagon coordinating all those things? Are you working independently? Okay.
Shockingly, no. My primary interface was with U.S. Special Operations Command, and they were tagged as the agent to integrate some of those other capabilities. But a lot of that, as I recall, that irregular warfare portion, I don't know the office that Starbaby worked with specifically, but they had stood up another squadron out there to help with some of those. But I believe they were working through ACC channels through the Air Warfare Center. And that reported back to Air Combat Command and then up to the building. So we see how all of that stuff flows out. I've kind of got disengaged from it because once my joint time was up, they moved me as when you're a joint officer like that, getting your time in the Pentagon, they want you to have a minimum of 22 months. You're supposed to have 24 months on the job. I get picked up right at the 22-month point to leave, go be the vice wing commander at Cannon, and then out of that deploy to Africa to be a task force commander in Africa, running ops down there. And that kind of concludes my active duty involvement with light attack. But when I retired in 2016, I get hired by a company that L3 Harris had just purchased called Force X. And Force X, they were probably the leaders at the time in something called agile software programming. And they had done all the mission management system on the MC-12s. They had the AC-130 gunship. They had another classified SOCOM program that had about close to 1 million flight hours on it. So a pretty impressive system that they had. We heard that light attack was coming, but I knew from my days in OSD that there was another problem looming on the horizon for the system, and that was within SOCOM, and that was replacing the U-28s. So this is the U-28. It's a manned ISR program that Air Force Special Operations Command flies, and they became the primary CAS stack manager, if you will, out on the battlefield. We had a couple folks, 4 folks on the airplane, 2 pilots, 2 CISOs, a series of sensors, and a lot of radios, and they could manage all the radio comms, plus they could import and export video on the airplane. They were flying so much that they had purchased these airplanes. Most of them were purchased off the street from other vendors, and they were just flying the wings off them. So it was getting to be, I guess I'll go back in time just a little bit, towards the end of my assignment in OSD Cape. And Francis Ekman, who had backfilled me over in TAC Air, he was leading an effort on, I think it was called the 30-year aviation plan for DoD. It's a congressionally mandated report that the services and DoD have to submit to Congress that talks about the state of the fleet of all the airplanes that DoD operates. And it gets into things about how many hours they have on it, what's the flying hour cost, all of that. And he said, hey, you know, I'm going through some of this stuff, but I can't find any of the SOCOM stuff. Can you help me out with that? I'm like, sure. So I go into the system. There's a little thing called pick codes. I pull out all the codes on the gunships, on the MC-130s, but there was nothing on the U-28 in the system. And that just kind of got my attention. Like, what in the world? And what was different about the U-28 was the Air Force had not procured the airplanes for SOCOM. SOCOM had done this on their own. So the way the system works, if something is called service common, then the services proper have to purchase it for SOCOM, and then SOCOM pays the difference to do all any modifications they would want to do, adding sensors. So in the case of a C-130, the Air Force would buy Air Force Special Operations Command, a slick, brand new C-130J, and then SOCOM would pay, you know, millions and millions of dollars to add the weapons, the sensors, the self-protection system on there. So because of that, this airplane SOCOM had purchased it all on their own. It wasn't being tracked in the Air Force system. So there was another database out there called REMIS. I had a really sharp analyst working with me, and she went in and started pulling the REMIS data on the U-28s, and we found out that they were flying this thing to where it was going to time out much faster than anybody knew. So I told Francis about it. I said, hey, let me go ahead and put this briefing together, but I think this is worthy. We're going to have to take up to the boss and say, hey, we need a wedge in the palm in that 5-year plan that the DoD builds, that they're going to have a replacement for this thing, or they're going to have to set aside some money for a major service life extension. And I'll never forget, I put the brief together. I guess I shouldn't say his name. He was, the guy was, I think, a nuclear physicist by trade, both his undergrad and graduate degree, I think from Duke or something. I mean, the guy, and he was brilliant, super nice guy, but he was a super user of all the classified stuff we had. And he was managing a lot of the big programs from the Virginia, you know, subs, new carriers, F-35, F-20. He's got all the big numbers rolling around in his nugget. And I get an appointment on his calendar, and I go in and brief, and I said, hey, I need a wedge in the palm to replace this airplane. And he said, no, what? And he goes, what airplane? I said, it's the U-28, sir. And he goes, U-28, I just bought that thing a couple of years ago. I mean, what are you talking about? He goes, they're not flying the wings off it. No, he goes, no, the F-16 CJs, those guys are flying the wings off the airplane. I think they're supposed to fly 250 to 300 hours a year, and some of them are flying like 400 hours a year. Like, with all due respect, sir, one U-28 flew 190 something hours last month. You know, they're always in the air. And when his response to me was what it boiled my entire assignment down to this one response. And he goes, oh, now U-28, what does that thing do again? And I'm like, and it's not a slight against him. It's that he was managing the big high level programs, and U-28 is quietly out on the battlefield, you know, just doing its job, but nobody was tracking it. And that was kind of the flavor that extended from the U-28 to the light attack all the way across the enterprise at that point, that it just wasn't a big giant needle mover, and nobody really was tracking it.
Why
So
why did Special Operations Command get the U-28 then? MC-12, the platform for MC-12 is used by the Army. The Air Force obviously bought it for the Liberty role. Horned Owl, we talked about some
mhm.
derivations of it in a previous episode. Why also buy U-28 then? Why not just consolidate and just go with a single platform and then just put a different set of mission sensors on it?
My assessment would be allocation of air power. SOCOM is typically drastically under-resourced. If you think about the SOCOM budget on September 10th, 2001, it was $2.4 billion. On September 13th, 2001, it was $14.2 billion. So, the tides changed a little bit,
Okay.
and they never had enough resourcing. So SOCOM, because they were the force du jour at the time, they took advantage of it and got the money to build platforms. And let me give you a great example. Right after OIF, the OIF proper, the full invasion is over with, and we start to settle in to more of a peacekeeping, or as the insurgency starts to build, they had a huge tour at Hurlburt, and all of the GOs from around the Air Force, the Secretary of Defense, even President Bush flew in to visit. So we put on this huge dog and pony show. I'll never forget doing the show, and I'll even tell a quick funny story. I think the first thing they did was they put them on the MC-130, all these generals, and I think they had 6 or 7 MC-130s. They put them all on there. They went out and did a low level. They might have done some airdrop of folks. They came back and they landed. They put them on MH-53 helicopters. They went out and they did their thing. They shot the miniguns and all that. And then we had 6 AC-130 gunships lined up at the end of the field in hot cargo. And the 53s landed right behind us. They transloaded all these generals and DVs onto the 6 gunships, and we take off and we go do our thing. And I'm out and I'm shooting on a range called Bravo 7. And I think it was General Wald. I think he was the USAFE commander at the time. We had put him in the back and he was in the IR seat. And there was an instructor IR sitting there with him, and we're shooting. And he asked over the intercom, "Hey, have you guys ever done any air-to-air work?" Typical pointy nose guy wants to know, "Hey, there's a gun. Can we shoot air-to-air?" And I said, "Hey, the only time they really ever looked at it was during the Panama operation, as I understand it. With the 20s, they had looked at, hey, how could they strafe if Noriega tried to get on his Learjet? There goes my earbud. Could they strafe the airplane or strafe in front of the airplane to stop him?" Just as I said that, and I must point out, in between 2 rounds of 40 millimeter. So 1 round is out, the second round just goes off. An MC-130 Talon II flies dead center through my HUD. And my heart stopped. I'm like, "Are you kidding me?" And I didn't hit him. And I was like, "What just happened here?" Okay, and can you imagine, not only if we had fratted an MC-130, but it's the 4-star that does it while we're flying. And the end of the story is the next day I write it up in the after action report, and I was in the approved range airspace. I had a mission number. All my boxes were checked. Well, the Talon II squadron, one of the Stanoval guys calls over to the weapons school and says, "I'm trying to find out who the pilot was on that gunship. He almost shot down at Talon II." So I knew the squadron commander, and I called him up and I said, "Hey, dude, did your Talon II have a mission number and clearance to be in the range?" And he's like, "No, man, it was me. I was late and I cut the corner." And I'm like, "Well, you better harness your captain here, because he's getting ready to open a can of worms that you don't want opened." And he's like, "Yep, I'm on it." So yeah, it was interesting times. But the outflow of that visit was they gifted AFSOC 4 more gunships that AFSOC didn't really want, because what they directed, we had 2 squadrons. We had the AC-130H that I flew, 8 of those, and they had the AC-130U. At that point, they had 13. So what they directed was that they produced 4 more U-model gunships, and they went out to the air mobility fleet. They harvested 4 airframes, and they gave the money to AFSOC to modify those airplanes to make up for the shortfall in the battlefield, because we were the two most deployed squadrons in the Air Force. What AFSOC really wanted to do was take that money and roll it into the next generation of gunship and try to get ahead of the curve, but they wouldn't let them do it. So they had to go back and find old mission computers that were 20 years old and old other equipment to equip these additional 4U models. And that's just kind of the story of AFSOC, getting at times getting pushed around, but really through subterfuge behind the scenes, getting things that they want. And that's another way that they got the U-28. They just said, hey, there's this insatiable demand on the battle space. AFSOC and SOCOM in particular were different. The best way to describe it is the way we were being employed was not to take a UAS or a U-28 or a gunship and go out and scan a convoy route. No, we were manhunting. We would track a bad guy. We would have an unblinking eye over his house for long periods of time, 30 days, watching him with a UAS, with a U-28, and then waiting for the right time to strike, but also building out that person's network to see who else they were talking to. And that's where the airplane really came into its own, was helping to control that. And then in a dynamic fight, as I mentioned, in a big cast fight, controlling assets, saying who's going to employ at what point, and making sure people don't run into each other.
Can I ask a little bit more about U-28 then, and maybe this becomes something that we discuss in more detail when we talk about gunship. But broadly, are the things that it's doing the same as you would have with the Liberty? So I know Liberty had the ability to monitor pattern of life. So they were doing that. They would find a guy on the ground in Afghanistan, follow him around, intercept his mobile phone calls, do all of the signals intelligence, communications intelligence, and tracking. And then they could say, okay, well, on a Tuesday, this guy goes to the market and buys some peppers or whatever, and then he comes back, and then his wife goes out, and they can map it out, and then they can decide how if they wanted to take him out, they can decide how to do that. So U-28 is doing the same sort of thing,
it's doing the same sort of thing. It's also managing the cast stack in a big dynamic fight or a big soft operation where SEALs might be hitting from 3 different directions. You've got the Task Force 160 is, flying in low level, delivering folks to the X, doing a fast rope. You're going to have a U-28 overhead monitoring that and helping deconflict other assets, strike assets. I can't get too deep into the tactics, but you would assign zones of control around an objective where one platform might have this piece, another platform would move out a layer. What you're going to do with things like squirters, containment fire, because ultimately we were trying to catch the bad guys if we could. We wanted to exploit that and build out their networks and yeah.
So it was sometimes capture rather than kill or capture.
You did what you had to, but if you could capture, especially in certain targets that you wanted to do that, and that's where we built out that capability with U-28 and some of the others to do it.
Okay. And another question I have to ask, because people will give me a hard time if I don't, but you've mentioned twice a classified part of the world that you lived in. That million flight hour program, was that what you were going to go to before you got asked by Miss Simmons to join you in the Pentagon? We're going to go to something else. Okay. All right. Okay. So you get to the point then when you retire, you leave the Air Force. Are you aware of? You said that you went back to AC-130 and you were sort of consumed by that world. But are you aware of Combat Dragon 3? Are you aware of what Starbaby and Hankey have been doing for a brief period of time in evaluating those 2 aircraft?
I am loosely and lovingly tracking what they're doing from afar. Really cheering them on. Was a big fan of what they were doing with the OV-10. I knew it had made a difference, and I was wondering, would the Air Force finally latch onto this and do it? I think the punchline, I'd be curious to hear Starbaby's point of view later on, but to me, it seemed like the Air Force was going to fight it no matter what. One of the big advocates for this capability was Senator John McCain, and I heard many within the building say, we're just going to wait him out. They were waiting for him to leave office or waiting for him to pass away. which was a really sad thing. But I heard multiple senior folks say that.
Because I think he had cancer, didn't he?
He did. He had cancer. And,
okay.
Yeah.
So what are you, just again, not to sort of want to labor on the point, but I'm just curious to know then from an inside point of view. So Ms. Simmons has put her name on the paper. The Air Force is kind of doing this like limited operational experiment, the LOE, looking at light attack. You've said, well, you could have these 120 or so aeroplanes, 100,000 flight hours, keep all our guys and girls in the cockpit and retain that skill base. What sort of feedback is she getting? What changes when she puts her name on the bottom of the paper? What's happening? What are the internal machinations of the Pentagon and the DoD around then this piece? And what are you seeing in terms of the pushback?
Well, the pushback was interesting, and it manifested itself initially in a slightly different way. She had me going around briefing some of the other folks on the air staff. And I was a lieutenant colonel at the time. I'm a colonel select, but I'm below the zone. I'm not going to pin on forever. I knew that. I might not even pin on at all during the assignment because I was going to be one of the last, I think, 22 people on the list. And it's probably important to note that, a lieutenant colonel, a major in the Pentagon, you're just a staff officer making coffee and, doing what other people say. So I was getting pushed around in a lot of these meetings. I'm a pretty strong personality. I would speak my voice, but still at the end of the day, all these other colonels, they didn't want to hear what I had to say. They didn't want to hear it because I was a lieutenant colonel, but they really didn't want to hear it because it was about a turboprop or something like that. Come on, man. Air Force doesn't fly props anymore. Miss Simmons went to one of those meetings with me and saw what was happening. And unbeknownst to me, I think she had talked to my new boss over in irregular warfare. And the Air Force has a process called frocking, where you will put the rank on. You just don't get the pay, but it's meant to be when you're in a position of authority or whatever, somehow to add another layer of respect. And there's only a certain number that can happen. So I didn't even think it was an option. I certainly didn't ask, but next thing I know, I get a call from the colonels group and said, hey, you're going to pin on the first of next month. You're not going to get paid till sometime next year, but you can go ahead and put the rank on. So once I put the rank on, things changed a little bit. We started to get, I think, a little bit of traction, but not long. Well, two things happened. And the dates sort of line up. So let me kind of walk you through a story that happens. It's related to the C-130s, but it helps paint the environment. And the punchline of this is Secretary Gates leaves, Panetta comes in. And that really kind of changed the flavor of a lot of things that were happening. But around that same time, the Air Force, often with long production airplanes like the C-130 that other people fly, other services and other nations, they'll do what's called a multi-year buy. So they would, in this case with Lockheed Martin, they had contracted for a 10-year buy of the platform, that they were going to purchase so many every year. And in exchange for that, they got a discount because it helped Lockheed get long lead items, find more efficiencies, economies of scale in their production line. Well, in that line, I believe it was United Arab Emirates had previously committed to buying 16 C-130Js, and they backed out. So the Air Force was still on the hook. I found out about it, and I'm like, awesome, we'll take them. Let's get them over to Air Force Special Operations Command. And a little bit selfish on my part, but not really, because the 4th SOS, which flew the AC-130U, the 16th SOS, which flew the AC-130H, and I believe it was the 9th SOS. At the time they were flying the MC-130P, were the three most deployed squadrons in the United States Air Force. I mean, it was you're gone 90, you're home 90, just never-ending rotation. There were guys in the 4th SOS and the 16th that had done 13, 14 deployments back to back.
Really?
And the airplanes, they were holding up, but they were some of the oldest platforms in the Air Force. I think the 9th actually had some of the either the 9th or one of the rescue squadron had the oldest airplanes out in the fleet. But even the AC-130Hs that I flew were 69 model C-130s that had flown in Vietnam. So the big Air Force guys up on the staff, they all came into my office in OSD, and I said, hey, look, we've got these 16 platforms. There is a plan to replace C-130s within Air Force Special Operations Command, but it's a very extended timeline to do so. And I said, hey, I'd like to bring some of these airplanes over sooner. And believe it or not, it actually saves the government money, because the flying hour cost in the C-130J was far less than on the legacy airplanes. And for the C-130J at that time, they were going to cut the crew component. So the overall O&M cost was going to save billions of dollars. The Air Force was against that because they wanted the airframes, and they could care less, as the 106 at the time told me, we could care less about the O&M because USOCOM pays that. It's not our problem. So when every year when the budget is done and it goes through an adjudication process called program review, and if something's a real hot button item, it's controversial, that the parties don't agree, it'll go to what they call a 3-star programmers. That's where the 3-star 8-level folks within each of the services will have a meeting to try and adjudicate it. If that doesn't happen, it can go to a large group, or what they call a small group. A small group is a very small group of senior folks that will adjudicate. Usually it's the Secretary of Defense, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Chief Staff of the Air Force, the SecAF, or whoever they designate. So the very first issue that day, or excuse me, that year, was the reallocation of those C-130 platforms. And I had built a case. I'm like, let's go to war. So we get up there, and they're briefing, and it was Deputy Secretary of Defense Lynn. And the issue came up, and the Air Force started to push back. And he said, wait a minute. We went through QDR, and I already went through this whole thing. What part of replace the gunships didn't you understand? And the Air Force immediately folded. I mean, it was dramatic to watch it happen. And I thought, wow, am I in the Pentagon and something good actually happened? So we went back to the office. You're not supposed to have alcohol in the office, but a couple of us were sitting there. I pulled out a bottle of bourbon, and we poured ourselves a little shot. And I'm like, this is crazy. Nothing good ever happens here. And we made a difference today. So the next day, that colonel, I won't say his name, Air Force guy, retired as a 3-star. He showed up in the office, and he's like, hey, Buck, what are you going to do? You guys lost. I'm like, were you not in the same room? No, we didn't. Well, the way those groups worked, at the end of the day, they had what was called a scorecard, and the decision was recorded, and either the SecDef or the DepSecDef would sign the scorecard, which turned it into a PITM, a program directive memorandum. It was basically, you're going to do this. That was his last day in the building. And when he left, he did not sign the scorecard. So they went all the way through program review. Several months later, the Air Force decided to re-adjudicate it. It was the last issue that year. And we lost.
Wow.
We lost. And it made me feel disgusting because the nation lost. It was costing more money. And the Air Force's rationale, I will never forget it to this day. I said, why are you doing this? To this colonel who ends up retiring as a 3-star. Well, we need to homogenize the fleet at Yokota. I'm like, the slick C-130 fleet at Yokota that deploys, they're in the AEF bucket like once every 2 years. I mean, my guys right here, they've been home for 90 days, but they had to spend part of that spinning up for their next deployment. They're right back out the door. Are you kidding me? And he just looked at me with a straight face and was like, yep. So the punchline is nothing good happens in the Pentagon.
Wow, that's crazy.
It is crazy. So I think that whole flavor continued across light attack as well, that atmosphere that I've mentioned from the U-28 recapitalization through the C-130, the change in SecDef, it just, there was no way to keep the momentum from what I saw on light attack or get the funding. I thought there would be momentum later on when they get to start maybe running the light attack experiment in 2016, 2017, I forget the exact time frame, because they were talking about putting a procurement order on the street for 300 airplanes.
Mm.
I do recall going to my boss at the time saying, be careful, I don't know if this will really happen. And they're like, oh, no, they said 300 airplanes. I'm like, okay, I've had the rug pulled out from underneath me before. So this might be a good time to maybe pivot over to Scorpion Jet. I don't know how we're doing on time.
Yeah, I mean, I've got more time. I'm not in.
Oh,
I've got
okay.
sort of 45 minutes, an hour left. If you're happy to, Buck, if you have to
Yeah.
carry on chatting. Okay, so just before we get to Scorpion, then, so with this experience in your in your sort of mind fairly fresh, then you get to retirement, you go and work for Force X, but then obviously you do return to light attack. Why? If you, I mean, what are you seeing? Because we talked before we hit record, and I can tell you've been very successful in industry. There are some obvious indicators to me that you're not, you don't just say you're a smart guy, you are a smart guy. You've been very successful. So what are you seeing as a retiree with all this experience? What are you seeing in light attack and going consulting on these programs based on the experience that you've had with the Air Force really showing no interest? And I think actually in the last episode, Starby, we talked about how the 3 or 4 star had just said to him, "Oh, look, it's a turboprop. I can't get over the fact that it's a turboprop. I'm not going to buy something that's a turboprop. I can't back it." So what are you seeing that's different?
Yeah, I think, and I can't take the credit. There were some other super sharp folks at Force X. The general manager was a former gunship pilot and U-28 pilot. I think he was a plank holder in U-28s.
What's a plank holder?
He was part of the founding,
Okay.
An original member of the group. I think it's an old Navy term. They give a plank off the deck or something, but they'll call them plank holders. There was another, I believe, plank holder who was the director of ops, who had flown gunships U-28s. And when he retired, I believe he was the high time combat pilot in the United States Air Force. He had over 5,000 combat hours.
Wow.
So he was wrapped up in the program. There was another guy that had recently left who'd flown gunships, U-28s, CV-22s, also had a deep interest in it. So that combined with the fact that the company was still working with the gunships, doing the system on the Liberty, and then a whole host of other classified ISR systems. When we started to hear that this was going to happen, we started, put some feelers out. Who could we partner with? What airframe? And I don't know who. I know Textron came to us at one point. We had talked to a couple other vendors, but I don't know who it was that had actually put 2 and 2 together that we were going to partner with Textron. I think one of the selling points on Scorpion for both sides of the partnership was they were equipped with a Garmin system, and the layering of our system in their airplane allowed us to push points to the Garmin without breaking the certification, which is a huge deal in the general aviation world. And that's like a $10 million piece of paper to get that IFR certification that you can manage data like that. It was the software suite that we had all those combat hours. We had modified it for Scorpion Jet, and it really added some extreme capability to the airplane that I didn't think was fairly represented or evaluated during the light attack experiment. I know Starbaby and I differ on that. In my mind, what was so unique about Scorpion Jet was it changed the paradigm. And I mentioned, with the T6, the first iteration, it was a mud fighter. Even with the T6 and the Super Tucano having sensors, in some regards, they were trapped in the old paradigm of lily pad operations, meaning you operated from that forward base, which makes sense. You want to be able to rearm, refuel, and do that, but they're slower speed platforms. So they're going to take off. They can range out 200 or 300 miles, have a limited duration. I think standard was about 4 hours at the most. So if you think about the ranging construct, you're going to have to use lily pads around the country to cover a large piece of territory. Scorpion jet was completely different. The wing was a very efficient wing. I think it came off the Latitude business jet. That was the starting point for it. So with Scorpion jet, you could take off, climb up to 40,000 feet, dash out for an hour at 400 knots or more, and get a very long distance away from a central operating location, drop down and spend 4 hours on station, then climb back up another hour, 400 knots to go back home. So doing that, your hands weren't tied by the lily pad. You could cover a lot more area with fewer airplanes. And in the modeling we ran on all the operational vignettes, you actually brought more firepower for longer periods of time to the warfighter. So probably a good point to talk about how leading into the light attack experience with Scorpion jet, how I thought unfairly our hands were somewhat tied. The first way was the airplane, because it was new, it was not certified. Only a test pilot could fly it. So they had, as Starbaby mentioned, I think, they had OV or A-10 pilots, Viper, Strike Eagle guys. None of them could fly the Scorpion jet. It had to be a test pilot school graduate. So our audience was drastically reduced. The second way, and perhaps even more unfairly, in my opinion, was we couldn't fly with all of the equipment that we had already integrated into the platform, and the first one being the helmet-mounted sight. And that's because it hadn't done ejection certification wearing the helmet. So nope, can't use it during the test. And I got to tell you, the helmet for me was an absolute game changer. What it did, particularly for soft guys, in reducing comms, drastically increasing SA on the battlefield, and then speeding the kill chain. So let me give you an example how that kind of manifests. In the AC-130, the missions I flew, especially early on, a lot of times they would clear us into a kill box, go kill what you see. And everybody thinks it's the sensor operators that find everything. Now, if you were past some sort of 9-line to a target, then yeah, the sensor operator is going to go to those coordinates, use some sort of other confirmation measures, profile or road patterns or whatever else it is to confirm you're on the right target. But about 50% of the things that I shot early on in the war were things that I just saw looking out the cockpit with my NVGs and seeing something moving out there. A lot of Toyota 4Runners. I can't tell you how many of those things we shot. But you would see that movement, but to get the airplane caged in on it, I didn't have access to the nav data up front, so I could just program in a waypoint. I had to physically fly the airplane to place whatever it was that target was over on the left side, somewhere close to the field of view of the heads-up display. And then I would have to take the sensor and visually talk him or her onto the target. So I'd see something, I start to maneuver the airplane. All right, give me the IR. IR's primary. All right, come forward, forward, forward. Stop, up, 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 up. Stop. That's your target. And that can take a little bit of time to do. Whereas with the helmet, with the reticle, there was a little death dot, if you will. And all I had to do was take my giant nugget, put that dot on the target, push one button, and it would shoot that into the system. Now everybody in the system could slave to that point, whether I was on a flying axis to put them on the tangent to see it or not. Also, the way we did it in Scorpion Jet with the software was it would populate a J message and shoot it out to the cast stack.
Nice.
So anybody else in the cast stack could immediately slave to that point as well. What an incredible capability to have on the battlefield in a very dynamic cast stack when you're trying to support the folks on the ground. Also with the helmet, I could look up within the cast stack and see, oh, there's 2 F-16s. They got 600 rounds of 20 millimeter. He's got another 35 minutes of playtime and 2 GPUs on board. No comms required. So your kill chain just running faster and faster. And without that capability, we just weren't able to demonstrate all the things that we had done in Scorpion. Two other quick stories about it. Just one very quick one. They were already leaning into the idea, perhaps at some point we would sell this to a partner nation. And as you know, language barriers can be an issue. The software was phenomenal. And if you wanted to change the language of the software, it was simply a matter of selecting a different DLL file. You didn't have to release a different block cycle. You just change the language to French, to Portuguese, or whatever. Done. I thought that was a pretty cool capability. But the hands-on stick and throttle setup that we had in there could also be user configured. So each pilot Wizzo could have their own selection. That was something we had learned in the U-28. They could have their own different scoreboard functions, did things. And during the experiment, one of the guys that flew it was an F-16 06 test pilot school grad. And I think he gave some feedback towards the end of the story. He said, "Hey, I love what you guys have done with the HOTAS, but I would do this." And I think it was something about slaving a sensor or a munition with a series of buttons. Well, the guys were like, okay. So that night they went in and reprogrammed it. They pushed it up to Wichita to the SIL, ran it through some regression testing for a couple days, and we came back out and uploaded it to the jet. And when he showed up 5 days later to fly again, it was done. And they told him, he's like, "What? Wait, no, what do you mean?" And I think he told us that would be a whole new block cycle in the F-16 that would take 9 to 12 months to get approved. And you guys just did it overnight. I'm like, yeah, that's how agile the software is.
Wow.
And we didn't get to show any of those capabilities. I think folks were really concerned, oh, it's a jet and you can't fly a jet in the dirt. Not true. You certainly could do it in the dirt. They had done some of the preliminary engineering, and if you looking at it, it almost looks a little bit like an SU-25, a twin tail SU-25, and there's certainly things you can do with louvers and stuff on the intakes. And I know when we did talk to the engineers, they're like, yeah, we talked about some things we can do, we just haven't done them because it's so early in the program. But it was immediately discounted. I think some of the other capabilities that were overlooked, 6,000-pound payload you could carry in an internal bay. So you could carry a lot of gas. You could carry 2 sensors. You could push the full motion video off the airplane. You could push the full motion video down to the ground party. And that was something, and I'll just give a little tease to the Skyraider II, that you could even push control of a sensor to a ground party.
Wow.
And we'll talk about that another day. Pretty cool capability.
That is very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a little, you talked very early on about the reliability, the maintainability of, the 86, and I'm assuming that, A29 is broadly comparable. How maintainable, mission capable rate, how much work has to be done to a jet? How does it compare in that respect?
Because it was leveraged off of a business jet as its basic starting life, business jets have very high maintenance reliability rates. They're meant to spend a lot of time in the air. The experience I saw, I don't believe they lost a sortie for maintenance during the experiment. I know that because it was a new airplane, there were still issues that had to be resolved. One of them was a bit concerning. We found out early on that the wiring for the fire bottles was reversed. So if you thought you were going to squirt retardant into the left engine, you were actually shooting it in the right engine. That would be bad on the good bad scale. In an actual emergency, that was found very early and addressed. I do remember that. And there were other teething problems because it was a new platform. And I think that contributed to a little bit of the bias against it, but standard stuff for a new airplane. But it was still a very rudimentary system. They put it on the road. It flew very well. I never saw any major maintenance issues.
What about cost? So you also talked about cost per flight hour when you were doing your paper, your classified paper, and you had all those costings. How did it compare in that respect?
It was going to be higher, twin engine airplane, and it's a jet, but it wasn't dramatically higher. It certainly wasn't going to break the bank. As I recall, these numbers are open source, but the initial estimates on T6 or AT6 back in 2006 were $500 an hour or less. I think that was a bit optimistic. By 2016, it was like, hey, it's probably, when you start to factor in the crew complement and all that, it's going to be $1,000 to $2,000 an hour, which is still a bargain. When you compare it to F-22 at that point, it was $44,000 per flight hour. just untenable. And the AC-130 gunship was pretty darn expensive as well. I think it was $15,000 to $16,000 an hour. But surprisingly, it was about the same as an A-10 at that point in time. So yeah, it was going to be more than the AT-6 or the Super Tucano, but again, it was breaking that paradigm because you were going to need fewer of them to provide the same amount of capability. But nobody really looked at that model.
Can we talk a little bit about speed and for want of a better description, the envelope or the criteria that you would normally be flying in a CAS type environment? So, in part two or part three, sorry, Hankey talked about Combat Dragon 2, talked about those OV-10s going out there and striking ISIS checkpoints, with the precision guided, the laser guided rocket, and saying, you would, because you could turn in a nice little tight little circle, you could just shoot one, circle back round, shoot another one, and they just really would have no idea what had hit them. Does that change if you're flying a jet? Does the speed at which things happen, the sort of area in which you're operating get bigger? What are the pros and cons then of having a jet versus a little turboprop that can go fairly slowly, has a high lift wing, and is able to get things done at its own pace?
Apologies for that. Surprisingly, the jet could drop down to slower speeds, not quite as slow as a turboprop, but the best way to say that there were TTPs that could address that, so you could still provide vast amounts of firepower. You didn't have, you weren't out there at 400 knots on orbit in the jet, flying these giant circles the size of the state of Indiana. It was still a very manageable orbit over the target that allowed you to bring a lot of munitions. And the fact that this thing carried a much larger payload, you had a much deeper magazine to provide those sustained fires over a target. So in my mind, it was kind of a wash.
You've already kind of answered the question, but I'll ask it anyway because you may want to address it directly. But you've said that it's because it's kind of based on a business jet, so it's designed to be sort of maintainable. But how much more complex is a jet than an OV-10? I mean, again, Hankey talked about the OV-10. He said, well, you've got some pneumatic systems, you've got electrical systems, you've got some really reliable turboprop engines. There's not really much going on. There's maybe a pump to put the gear down in an emergency, but that's it. Those are all the systems on the airplane. Does the jet change that?
I think it changes a little bit. I think when you start talking about turboprops specifically, like the PT6, there have been very few failures of the engine. And again, a teaser, I think I've got the pictures somewhere. AFSOC actually did have a failure of a PT6 on the Skyraider within the last year. But yeah, it turned out well. Everybody survived, walked away. But yeah, certainly the complexity level increases a bit with a jet and with a twin engine jet. But again, leveraging that, I think that business jet experience, they have very high reliability rates. So I don't think that we did specific analysis down to the level of comparing the maintenance work. Maybe some of the other program guys did, but I don't recall that we said, hey, it's going to be this much more to maintain it because the jet engine, has this higher rate of failure, which to my knowledge, it didn't. But I couldn't directly compare it to the PT6. I would certainly concede that a small single engine turboprop is going to be easier, probably out there to maintain by just one person.
So are you talking fundamentally then about a different model? I mean, you talked about paradigm shift earlier in not having to lily pad from sort of one forward operating base to another and to have the same effect, but with a small number of airplanes. But are you fundamentally then, if you're going to advocate for a jet to fulfill this role, you're advocating for a different way of doing business? You're not really saying, well, you can do business the same way with our jet as you could do if you had a turboprop.
I think you could. I think you could do business exactly the same way. If they had continued and had finished up the engineering work to take this thing to the dirt, I think you could have had a very similar employment construct. But I think having the capability of the jet open the aperture that you could change the paradigm. And it's funny that you mentioned it, very astute. the way things have gone, leading all the way to the Skyraider, which we'll talk about, you are beginning to put more and more capability of that CAS stack into a single platform. In fact, one of the selling points on the Skyraider II was what was called collapsing the stack. You didn't have to have just an ISR airplane overhead. You didn't have to have just a FAC-A sitting up there. You didn't have to have 2 or 3 airplanes carrying a loadout. In the case of this or the Skyraider, you have all of that in a single platform. And yes, it is a paradigm shift. I was in advocating for this, looking across the fleet, not just at light attack, but how could this replace perhaps U-28? Because it had so many of the same capabilities. You could get a lot of different utility out of a single platform, not just in the light attack realm. And it was very easy to fly and employ. It was actually well suited to partner nations as well. I mean, ultimately, the wing is a straight wing, very stable platform that a partner nation could learn to fly pretty quickly.
I'm hoping this is the Scorpion behind me. Otherwise, it's very embarrassing.
It is.
But I just want to try and get my head out of the way. So you can see there's a GBU on the wing of that airplane. Looks like there's maybe some Hellfire or something like that, Brimstone or some equivalent. How far down the road did you get them with weapons integration? I mean, presumably this is a publicity shot. Did you do weapon separation trials?
Yep.
You did. So do you recall what you could drop from it or shoot from it?
Yeah, you can see a loadout here with a GPU, provisions for rockets, Hellfire. I think the next picture, there's a great one with some GPUs, a provision for APKWS. And then if you'll notice on the bottom there, I don't know if my cursor's on it or not, that second sensor that you could deploy out of the bottom of the airplane. Having 2 sensors was a big deal because you could have the pilot flying one, you could have the CISO flying another, and then there were provisions to eventually offboard that sensor to Federation control. And then let me share one other picture with you. A pretty neat picture of Scorpion jet flying with an agile pod. So agile pod, for those that don't know, was a podded system that the Air Force Research Laboratory contracted with industry to come up with a common pod that you could fly on a wide variety of aircraft. And the intent was the pod would just be an empty shell and the customer could provision it however they wanted. They could have it as a comm node, a series of radios to provide additional capability. You could have some sort of electronic warfare capability. You could add another sensor to the pod. I think this particular pod has the sensor provisioned on the bottom of the pod. So having Scorpion jet set up to carry the pod and the integration to do that was yet another great capability that we had. And that's probably a good segue to talk for just a second about another key approach that we took, at least with Scorpion. I talked about agile software programming. So just for the listener, let me briefly describe that, and then I want to pivot into something called MOSA. So with agile, it was a different way of programming using software to program functions that you wanted it to do. So in the Stone Age days, when I went through and did, computer engineering and had to program things, you had to program with the punch cards and put things in, but you basically started at the first function that you wanted the software to do. You worked your way through that, then you went to step 2, and you just work sequentially down the line. That type of programming is called waterfall. As software programming through the years has become more professional, they discovered a different way called agile. And what agile does is the first thing they do is break down the project. What is it ultimately that you want this to do? And I'm being in very general, simplified terms here. And when they look at it, they would analyze and say, hey, look, of the 8 functions that it has to do from start to finish, step 5 is the toughest. That's where the real heart of the processing, the data sharing, whatever it is. So we're going to go ahead and focus a weight of effort on step 5 at the beginning. And we're going to do what they call a sprint. So for the next 2 weeks, we are all in on solving step 5. And the way you do that, and it would matriculate over to aircraft systems later on, is you agree that the input and output between each step is standardized. So no matter what you do, the input coming in is going to be in this format, this volts, this many bits, whatever is the data stream coming in, and the output of that is in this same format. And the government could not wrap their heads around it in the beginning, because they would come to us for some of the updates on programs we were working on. They're like, okay, we need a milestone understanding of where you are so we can make a progress payment. And we're like, we're probably 30% ahead of timeline. And they're like, okay, well, show us. We're step one. We're like, well, we haven't even done step one yet. And their heads would explode, and they're like, oh, you guys are behind. The program's in big trouble. We got to send a note to Congress because it's a program of record. We're like, no, no, it's not. We're ahead. Let me show you how. And it took a long time to get the government to understand that. Doing that a step further, and the government has finally latched onto it, is MOSA, is Modular Open Systems Architecture. So in the past, if you purchase an airplane, you're purchasing that OEM software and you're getting access to it, but likely the producer of the airplane still owns the rights to the software. So if you want to do something to it, modify it, like in the case of the gunship, when they wanted to add Hellfire, Lockheed said, oh, that's $100 million to get access to the software and make changes to it. And like, okay, that's a steep price to pay. And AFSOC learned a tough lesson. We'll talk about it when we talk gunships. So the government approach these days is everything has to be open. The government wants rights, or they want what's called an SDK, basically a software development kit, so they can go in and make changes. And the same is true for the hardware that's on the airplane. So, it takes 20 plus years to develop the F-22. What if there's a better box of knobs that comes along for a radar warning receiver or countermeasures, and you want to swap that out? Well, the input to that box and the output are agreed to on what's called an ICD. So the government isn't locked to a single vendor. They can go out and say, well, this company has produced something better, and we can modularly upgrade. Scorpion Jet was along that same vein, as was our software. When what we told the government when we delivered it, it will come with a software development kit. So if you've got a couple of smart majors up in the headquarters that find a new munition or a different way or a different TTP, they can go in and program it themselves. So that's kind of a different way of approaching the way weapons are procured these days. And I think that will be the standard going forward.
What happened to Scorpion then, Buck? I mean, where did you enter the fray? Where did you exit the fray? Does it exist in any form today?
I believe the jets are still out there. I know they continued to fly them around for a while after the light attack experiment. I think I heard talk that they were going to take it to a foreign partner or try and shape it to that. I don't know how that played out. But after the light attack experiment, as predicted, the Air Force bought nothing. So a lot of folks had leaned forward. I know we spent upwards of $30 million developing that software specific to Scorpion Jet. And I know there were some communications made to the government about, hey, you keep asking us to do this on our own dime. At the end of the day, it's a company that has to make money. I understand if you don't buy our product, but you didn't buy any product, and you asked industry to spend a hell of a lot of money, which they did. And I know Textron spent quite a bit of money. They built 2 of those jets. I know they're still out there. I presume they're still flying in one form or another.
How did you feel about that then? So you've obviously experienced some amazing things in the Air Force, and you've seen some disappointing things, some not so amazing things. Did that leave you with a sort of dented appetite for working with the Air Force? And how did you end up, I guess, then, and end up working on Skyraider II?
Yeah, it definitely did, especially because they didn't buy anything, and they were going to do it under a different construct called an OTA, an other than approach, that helped them acquire things rapidly. And when they didn't buy anything, yes, that did leave a pretty sour taste in our mouth. The way we got to Skyraider II was through Special Operations Command. So we start at the beginning where they put weapons on everything, and here, as we get to the end of the story, the platform that has actually been purchased has been purchased by SOCOM, and SOCOM ran a competition for the Armed Overwatch program. There's a couple machinations that happen along the way. I told you about the U-28 was probably going to time out. And for a long time, SOCOM had a program, Next Generation Manned ISR. They had looked at doing a family of systems, they cast a very wide net on how they would replace the platform. And ultimately, they settled on the Armed Overwatch program. Once it came up again under an OTA authority, being led by SOCOM this time, we had a much higher confidence that it was going to happen. So we invested quite a bit of money. We took some of the systems and lessons we learned on Scorpion and ported that over to Skyraider II. And the job that the folks did on what is now Skyraider II, simply amazing. That is a great platform. It's going to serve our nation well. Just like any other platforms, there's issues, but I am so proud of what that team did. And I left that company 2.5 years ago. We had already won at that point, and they were marching very quickly towards finishing up the development. But I was very proud to be associated with it, and it's a great story to tell when we get to it.
Well, that's fascinating. But before we call it a day for this episode, is there anything else we need to know about light attack? Anything else that you wanted to share?
I think we're good on light attack, but I don't think I've had a really funny story. And I know I've got to keep up with Star Baby somehow. So do you want the Boston cream donut story?
The donut story.
Okay. So I get to the gunship and I do my checkout. And at that point, the RTU was co-located at the same base as the operational squadron. In fact, we flew with mixed crews from them. So I show up at the squadron. I had taken my check ride on a Thursday night. I show up the next morning to do my formal in-processing. And I go over to current ops. They're the ones that manage the flight schedule. I'm thinking, okay, great. They're going to give me a training line next week. And they said, oh, new guy. Okay, great. You're deploying on Tuesday. I'm like, wow, okay, great. And at that point, we were deployed to Brindisi, Italy. I'm like, excellent. I can't wait to get over there, drink some wine. This is going to be great. And they said, yeah, no, you're going to Korea. I'm like, what? So Saddam Hussein was acting up back then. This is in 96. And they had decided to move another carrier to the Middle East to backfill some of the capability if they had to do strikes. Well, that left a gap in the Korean Peninsula. And every year, if you've ever been to Korea, the North is coming south in the spring. We got to get ready because all the indicators are there. So we decide to send 2 AC-130 gunships to replace a carrier battle group. That should tell you how good we were. So it's time for that deployment on that Tuesday morning. I show up and I'm just going to be an extra pilot. I'm just baggage. So, it's a long way to Korea. We were going to stop in California, Hawaii, Guam, and eventually work our way in. And one thing, we still had the 20 millimeters on the airplane at the time, and the 20s are just at the bottom of the flight deck, bolted to the floor. But on deployments like that, specifically going across the ocean, if you weren't deploying on an immediate contingency where you had to fall in for combat ops, they would take the 20s out and just ship them over, reinstall them once we got there. So there's like a bin where the 20 sat that catches all of the brass as the guns shoot. And that bin without the 20s there, they would throw a mattress in there. And where the guns would stick out of the ports, they would put up these little plexiglass windows. So I'm like, okay, I'm the extra pilot. So like any self-respecting, no good pilot, I lay down and start sleeping right there. I've got my Walkman playing some tunes or whatever, and I don't think much about it. And about 45 minutes after we take off, somebody starts kicking my boot and they're like, wake up, we need a pilot right now. I'm like, what? And I mean, I was out of it. And I look up and the squadron DO is coming off the flight deck and he is absolutely green. and he hand over his mouth, looks like he's about to puke. He goes running to the back of the airplane. Well, to relieve yourself in the gunship, we had a urinal on the side of the plane in the very back. You could stand up, and they had what they call the honey bucket. It's just a bucket strapped to the side of the airplane, and there's a curtain you could pull around yourself. I never had to use it my entire gunship career. So, that's a huge win right there. But he takes off for the back, and they're like, get up there, get up there. I'm like, all right. So I go up on the flight deck, and there was an IP in the right seat, but he had already unstrapped, and he was taking his helmet off, and he's just pointing at the left seat. Get in, get in. I'm like, okay. So I jump in the left seat, and he takes off for the back. I'm like, okay, well, now I'm the formation lead taking the squadron, to Korea. And the flight engineer and the nav pipe up and said, yeah, both of those guys are sick. Something's going on. So come to find out, one of the other members of the squadron had brought in what were supposed to be some fresh Boston cream donuts, but they weren't. And both of those other pilots got food poisoning. And I, in my ultimate wisdom, did not have a Boston cream donut. So I, as the functioning pilot, took us most of the way to Korea. And when we stopped along the way, and those guys were messed up for a couple of days. So at that point, when you got to the gunship squadron, I already had, a lot of flight time, over 1,000 hours. But they're like, oh, you're the new guy. You're not going to upgrade for a couple of years. Just sit down, shut up, and learn. I'm like, okay. So get us over there. I kept my mouth shut, flew the whole deployment. And we get back, and the boss calls me and, hey, Craig, you start your shooter upgrade next week. So I skipped a bunch of people. I jumped ahead 2 years in my career. And I guess I did okay because I deployed back to Korea the next year. And by that point, I was a full up instructor pilot, having been in the squadron only 1 year. So those two Boston cream donuts really took care of me and launched me out on this great adventurous fun that I had.
What would have happened then if you had also been ill? Was it coming out both ends? I mean, I don't want to get too graphic.
Yeah, pretty graphic. They were hurting both ends.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So in the gunship, we had in the middle, there's a booth where the sensor operators and the electronic warfare operator sits. But in front of that, we have like an actual full-size steel trash can with a lid. Because everybody's got box lunches and trash, and especially on long flights. And I understand somebody had to use the trash can because the honey bucket was occupied. And the gunship community is probably going to kill me for telling this story, but it was it made my career, so why not? I'm retired now; they can't hurt me.
That's awesome. Okay, Buck, it's been for me a 15 or 20-year wait, but definitely worth it. And I'm really, really excited to have you come back and talk about. I think we'll do Skyraider II because it's very topical, and then come back and talk about Gunship and CV22. But thank you so much for coming back on, for coming on the channel and telling us about your experiences of light attack. I think it helps put a different perspective on some of the things that we've heard from Hanky and Star Baby. And I'm very grateful to you for your time, and I hope the audience is too. So thank you. I look forward to seeing you again next time.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me on. I love the long form. You're getting the story out that just probably wouldn't have been told, and your questions are very intuitive. So I look forward to the rest of it, but I look forward just to hearing your podcast for years to come.
Thank you, Buck. Cheers.